It was deep winter in the Ardennes, a frozen forest where every breath turned to ice and every tree hid a threat. American troops had been told this sector was quiet, almost a rest area. Fresh divisions were rotated here specifically because the High Command believed nothing serious could happen. The ground was covered in thick snow, the forest was peaceful, and most soldiers assumed the enemy was beaten, retreating, and running out of options. But all of that changed in a single night. This is the story of the moment when America, with all its strength, all its momentum, and all its confidence, was just inches away from losing everything at the Battle of the Bulge. And it didn't happen slowly. It didn't unfold over days or weeks. It almost happened in one night because of surprise, panic, weather, and a level of German risk-taking nobody thought they were still capable of. The Americans were stretched thin along a massive line. Many men were newly arrived, barely experienced, and had never felt a large-scale attack. They were cold, tired, and scattered across small towns and forests. Most believed their biggest enemy was frostbite, not a major German push. On the other side of the forest, Hitler had secretly assembled what was left of his elite armored units. Tanks, armored vehicles, special forces disguised as Americans, and some of the most determined troops he still had. His plan was simple: smash through the American line by surprise, drive all the way to the coast, cut the Allies in half, and force a negotiated peace. Everyone in his circle knew it was desperate, but desperate plans can still do enormous damage, and the Ardennes was the perfect place because the Americans weren't expecting anything. As night fell, the fog grew thicker, snow hammered down, radios were unreliable, visibility dropped to almost nothing. For the Germans, this was perfect. For the Americans, it was a trap being sealed by nature itself. What happened next was one of the most chaotic nights in American military history. At around 5:30 in the morning, German artillery lit up the night sky. Thousands of shells smashed into American positions all at once, catching them completely unprepared. Entire units were woken up not by alarms, but by the sound of explosions ripping through the forest. Communication lines were cut instantly. Soldiers couldn't reach their commanders. Commanders couldn't reach headquarters. Headquarters couldn't figure out whether this was a small raid or a full-scale offensive. For the first crucial hours, nobody knew the scale of the threat, and that confusion was deadly. American outposts were hit first. Thinly defended and mostly manned by inexperienced troops, many of these positions were overwhelmed almost immediately. Tanks rolled through gaps before anyone even knew those gaps existed. Machine gun nests were surrounded. Roads that had seemed irrelevant suddenly became lifelines, and the Germans controlled many of them before sunrise. In those early hours, the US front almost collapsed completely. One division in particular, the 106th Infantry, was hit with such force that parts of it were surrounded before officers even understood what direction the attack was coming from. Entire companies were cut off in the dark. Platoons were scattered in the woods with no idea where friendly lines were. American soldiers described the night as shock, chaos, and a wall of steel appearing out of nowhere. Some units held their ground with everything they had. Others had no choice but to fall back as tanks burst through fog like ghosts. The German advantage that night was overwhelming. They had studied the terrain for weeks, moved their units under cover of darkness, and used the weather like a natural shield. Their tanks rolled down roads the Americans assumed were too thick with snow to be used. They appeared from angles nobody expected, and because the night was so dark and visibility so low, Americans could barely tell where the attacks were strongest. To make it worse, German special forces dressed in American uniforms were already behind the lines, switching signposts, causing confusion and spreading rumors. Every soldier who heard an unfamiliar accent suddenly wondered if the man next to him was an imposter. Trust broke down at the worst possible moment. By sunrise, the front line wasn't a line anymore. It was a maze of isolated pockets trying to make sense of a disaster. The reason America almost lost the entire battle in this single night comes down to three things: surprise, misjudgment, and weather. The surprise was total. American intelligence believed the Germans were too weak to launch anything like this. Reports of German movement were dismissed as minor. The Ardennes was considered low risk, so US forces there were not prepared for a major strike. Then there was misjudgment. Many American positions were spread thin, with long gaps between strongpoints. Commanders assumed the terrain itself would stop any large attack. They were wrong. The Germans came through those same forests with practiced precision. But the weather was the final decisive factor. The thick fog meant American planes, one of the biggest Allied advantages, couldn't take off. There was no air reconnaissance, no air strikes, no ability to slow the German armor. The US Army fought blind, and for a few critical hours, that blindness nearly cost them everything. One of the most dangerous moments of the night came when German armored units punched deep into the American line faster than expected. If they had reached certain crossroads just a few hours earlier, they could have trapped entire American divisions and destroyed the logistical backbone of the front. In one town, St. Vith, American troops fought through the night to hold the roads that would determine whether the US Army stayed alive or collapsed. The Germans attacked again and again, using the dark to conceal their movements. But American units fought back with fierce determination, using every building, every patch of snow, every corner of the town to slow the advance. That delay became crucial later, but during the night itself, commanders feared they were losing control. Another near catastrophe happened near the Schnee Eifel, where two entire American regiments were surrounded before they even realized they were encircled. By the time the sun rose, they were cut off, struggling to break out, and their fate would become one of the most painful chapters of the entire battle. American soldiers reported seeing long streaks of tank headlights moving like a river of fire through the trees. To many, it looked like the entire German army was pouring through the lines. In reality, the Germans were still limited by fuel shortages, but the scale of the night attack made it feel like an unstoppable wave. In some areas, American units fell back so fast that they left maps, equipment, and vehicles behind, only adding to the chaos. Rumors spread that the Germans were using captured American gear, which made identification even harder in the dark. Soldiers became jumpy, unable to tell friend from foe. At headquarters, confusion reached breaking point. Reports contradicted each other. Maps became useless. Commanders tried to assemble a picture of what was happening, but the battlefield had changed too fast. For a brief moment, some feared the Germans might not only break through, but actually cut the American position in half. The worst-case scenario, one Hitler desperately hoped for, was suddenly closer than anyone wanted to admit. If the Germans had captured key road networks that night, the entire US First Army could have been surrounded. Supplies would have run dry, communications would have collapsed completely, and the front in Western Europe might have experienced its most devastating setback of the war. But even in that terrifying night, American resilience started to show. Small groups of soldiers held crossroads against overwhelming odds. Engineers blew bridges at the last possible minute. Tank crews fought delaying actions in pitch-black conditions. And although the Germans came close to collapsing the American line, they were slowed enough for reinforcements to mobilize. It wasn't luck, it was determination. America didn't lose the battle that night, but it came dangerously close. If just a few towns had fallen faster, if a few roads had been taken earlier, if weather had held for one more day, the entire Western Front could have changed. By morning, the Germans had made huge gains, but the window for a total collapse had passed. The Allies were now aware of the threat. Reinforcements were on the way, and once the weather cleared, American air power would return with devastating force. But none of that changes the fact that for one night, just a single night, America was on the edge of losing everything in the Ardennes. A night where the quiet forest erupted into chaos. A night where darkness and fog fought on the German side. A night where the US Army came closer to collapse than most history books ever admit. The Battle of the Bulge would rage on for weeks, becoming one of the hardest fights America ever faced. But it was that first night, the shock, the confusion, the panic, the unexpected breakthrough that nearly handed Germany a victory they desperately needed. In war, sometimes everything hangs on a single moment, and for America in the Ardennes, that moment happened in the dark, in the snow, on a night where the world almost changed.